Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me as always is Anthony Tresca.
Hello. Happy Merry Seasonal Holiday greetings to all of you out there. We are so excited and very, very thankful to have you join us for our very special holiday episode, 2015's Krampus.
Exciting times.
Mm-hmm. I believe you.
Yeah. Podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and just simply the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares. I am a sucker for a good holiday horror film, and it doesn't even actually honestly have to be good. I like holiday horror.
I too am a big fan of themed horror as a whole, so just anything that really commits to one specific aesthetic or gimmick throughout, I'm really there for it.
One of the worst movies I've seen, but it delights me, is Thanksgiving. Because it's just yes, I didn't know I needed a Thanksgiving. This turkey's going to pop out of some people after saying lines like, "You've been stuffed." I didn't know I needed that, right? So I just love holiday horror. And Krampus very much fulfills all those things. It's a delightful example of...
I don't quite remember anything jumping out and saying you've gotten stuffed.
Fortunately not.
Krampus,
but there's still so many great holiday moments where you're in between watching Christmas Vacation, I'm going to watch this other delightful exploration of how families are horrible.
And this does feel a lot like Christmas Vacation. It just is what would happen if Krampus showed up on that Christmas Vacation.
and I find that rather delightful.
Before we get too overwhelmed talking about the Krampus and all of the holiday season's greetings that he brings, let's begin with a little bit of framework.
Yes, so this year's holiday present is some critical theory on monsters.
That is our gift to you. You don't have to pay anything for that.
Exactly, and you get to virtually unwrap it and everything. Mm-hmm. So this is coming from Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who, if ever there is somebody that the moment you mention monsters, people begin to cite as the person who's kind of defined monsters for us, it's Jeffrey Jerome Cohen. So this is coming from Monster Theory Reading Culture, which is an edited collection of a whole bunch of different really great essays, but his is titled Monster Culture 7 Theses. He says there are sort of these 7 things that he's going to say that all monsters sort of share. Mm-hmm. So what I thought I would do is just kind of go through the bolded, here's what the thesis is, here's his argument that he's proposing a monster is regardless of culture, regardless of text, because I think that it'll become kind of apparent that Krampus meets all of these definitions really nicely. So the first one is that the monster's body is a cultural body. And by that, it means that the way that the actual monster's body is shaped is dictated in part by the culture that is producing it.
And that pretty specifically applies to Krampus. Krampus is a cultural figure descending from a lot of history, which I will get into in just a second.
Exactly. So then the second one, and again, this happens in the film, the monster always escapes. And it's interesting that we end, in that final moment of the film in his, workshop. Mm-hmm. But we still feel like he's escaped and he's just going to go on his merry way and now destroy someone else's life because they made an ill-advised wish. The third one is the monster is the harbinger of category crisis. And what Cohen means by that is that the monster escapes in part because it refuses easy categorization. Is Krampus a god or a monster, as we will discuss later? Mm-hmm. Is he a human or more of a humanoid, or is he more animalistic, right, in form? Or, well, the answer is again kind of a little bit in between both.
The answer is yes.
Yeah, pretty much. The next one is that the monster dwells at the gates of difference. So the monster is different from us, and it's in our presence to remind us that it stands out as this other. The next one is that the monster polices the borders of the possible. So I always think about this one about here there be monsters sort of note. Mm-hmm. This is the line at which you go past and you have to say, okay, well, I'm no longer in my safe space. And again, think of the number of times that with the concept of a border is present in the film.
and then the destruction of said border.
Exactly, again and again and again. The next one is that fear of the monster is really a kind of desire, and it's a little bit more easy like in a vampire film, right? Because you're like, oh, his long flowing locks or sparkly skin is so attractive.
I'm sure someone on the internet has done that with Krampus.
Ew, that's so gross.
Let me check.
So gross.
What do I look up to find this?
I don't know, but just know that it's going to always be in your search.
Rule 34. Oh, yep. Yep, there is.
What is Rule 34?
Rule 34 is if it exists, there's porn of it.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So gross. Okay. So we don't normally, usually we would edit out that, but we thought that traumatizing trip down Rule 34 lane was something that you all should have to experience and not just me.
Yeah, and if you are interested in Rule 34 version of Krampus, it does exist, dear viewers.
You can look it up on the internet.
Yes.
So, beyond though just the physical or sexual desire, it's also a desire for wanting things, right? And again, it's we would like order. We would like Christmas to be the way we want it to be. We would like people at Christmas time who are obnoxious to get their comeuppances. And so it's desire in a lot of respects. And then the last one is, and I like that he ends with this, the monster stands at the threshold of becoming, and he says, monsters are our children. They can be pushed to the farthest margins of geography and discourse, hidden away at the edges of the world and in the forbidden recesses of our mind, but they always return. And when they come back, they bring not just a fuller knowledge of our place in history and the history of knowing our place, but they bear self-knowledge, human knowledge, and a discourse all the more sacred as it arises from the outside. And then he said they ultimately ask us why we have created them. So I just think that this is a lovely framework because I think the film kind of it's almost like, and check, and our monster is this, and our monster does this. In part because Krampus is a real monster. He's grounded in folklore and culture.
Yes, he is. That's very true. And I will get into that right now. So,
Yay.
The Krampus is a 2015 film written and directed by Michael Dougherty. He is written... Krampus is a 2015 film written and directed by Michael Dougherty. He has written scripts for 2003's X2, the X-Men movie, Superman Returns, Trick or Treat.
Which is one of my favorites. I'm a big fan of that film.
It's a good one. And then he directed and co-wrote Godzilla King of Monsters. It's his most recent one. Krampus stars Adam Scott, Toni Collette,
who we have already praised and will happily praise again. She is just
happily do that.
Doing such a good job in her horror films
This was
lately.
Before Hereditary.
It was.
Yeah.
And I feel like she's kind of found that niche of the type A parent who loves in a really abrasive sort of fashion.
Yeah, because you definitely see strands of the Krampus performance carried over into her Hereditary performance.
You do.
For sure. Film also stars David Koechner, beloved character actor, and Alison Tolman. So
who also is pretty fantastic.
Also very good. This is a good cast.
It is a good cast, and I think that makes a difference. There are lots of bad films that have great casts, and a lot of good films that don't really have anyone recognizable. But I just think that when you can have such a great ensemble, you're going to set yourself up for success.
Yeah, and I think that's what this film does. It's got, if nothing else, you can latch on to the cast and their performances and just go along with them for a good, fun Christmas romp.
And each of them really has a moment to shine as a character and as an actor, and I think that's also really nice because a lot of times you just have, this one character that's only going to have a second. But, every character, if you were to divide up the minutes, it'd come out pretty equal that every moment has their, sort of redeeming moment, their moment that you're like, my goodness, you're terrible. And just, also their comedic moments.
And this is, particularly good in a horror film where you have to care about the characters dying.
Exactly.
Because if these are just run-of-the-mill nothing characters who you don't know, it doesn't matter. I think that also does help that they're kind of recognizable because you're like, oh no, Adam Scott from Parks and Rec is gone.
Exactly.
Now he's gonna sacrifice himself.
Exactly.
Not Ben.
I know, and I think that really does help. I think it can hurt sometimes because you're I think about the remake of Amityville Horror and how Ryan Reynolds is in it, and you're like, is this scary because it's Ryan Reynolds? And he's so funny, and but so I can be detracting, but in this case, it just sets everything up for glory.
So, Dougherty talked about that the reason that he really wanted to do this was because the Christmas that many people often think of, with the candy canes, the little drummer boys, and the nativity scenes, is not the Christmas that he was interested in. And as he points out in an interview with Bloody Disgusting, that version of Christmas that we're celebrating in malls, that's not Christmas. The Christmas that he's actually referring to is the real Christmas that finds its roots in paganism. Long ago, before Christmas trees were the spots for Santa, the evergreen trees were used as a repellent against ghosts and illnesses. He goes on to talk about how Christmas used to be a very spooky, mystical pagan holiday. It was debaucherous. People stuffed themselves and got drunk. They believed in dark winter spirits and ghosts and Christmas witches. So there's a whole side of the holiday which has not been explored or embraced, and I think it needs to be brought back to complete Christmas.
And what's interesting is that, so you're talking, of course, about something that in pagan culture would have been quite some time ago in its, like, really richest form. But there are lingering elements that have survived the sanitization of Christmas. And one of the things that I think we should be bringing back, by the way, as a culture, is the telling of ghost stories, right? I think we often forget that A Christmas Carol is first and foremost a ghost story.
And I think it's significant that A Christmas Carol does make at least a brief appearance in this film.
Yes, I think it was, like, a very clear nod and tip of the hat. But also, if you think about some of the, like, songs about Santa, they're terrifying, right? Like, he sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you've been good or bad. He's been judging you all year. Have you been found wanting? Right?
Is he a jolly figure who is bringing you presents, or is he a child predator who is stalking your children?
I mean, there is some question of that, and I think that, like, again, if you look at sort of the way that we set up this culture is, like, this is your time to be perfect or not. We have kept some of that, like, darkness. It's just that we often forget it in light of, you know, the shiny wrapping. Exactly.
So, Dougherty talks about how he came across this Krampus myth. He says in an interview with the Dean of Geek, it was about 10 years ago. This was the ancient time of the internet before social media really popped up. And friends started forwarding me the Krampus greeting card that had started floating around online. It was just sort of love at first sight. I'd always wanted to do a scary Christmas movie. I used to draw on my own creepy greeting cards and send them out to friends and family, and those would feature the carnivorous snowman and Santa Claus falling into some mishaps and things like that. So I knew back then that there was definitely a movie to be made about the character, but it wasn't until about 2011 when I started working with my two co-writers, Todd Casey and Zach Shields, and we started crafting what the story would actually be. So, I mean, it's been a bit of a long time in the making.
But I think it paid off because it meant that it was a lot more cohesive than I think it would have been. It's not perfect, but it's a lot more cohesive than it would have been if he had just, you know, pushed it out straight off.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And, I mean, there's a lot of, like, really interesting craft elements that have gone into it. In particular, the one that I am the biggest fan of is the visual and practical effects in this film, made by Weta Workshops, which is a special effects and prop company from New Zealand.
And they are amazing.
Yes, and they are pretty well known. They've worked on a lot of really interesting stuff. I've just chosen some of their more well-known work. They are really well known for their work on Lord of the Rings, obviously, New Zealand company. They've also done iRobot, Hellboy, The Chronicles of Narnia, District 9, Avatar, Mad Max Fury Road, Thor Ragnarok, and Blade Runner 2049, just to name a few.
So one of the things we haven't had a chance to really talk about, because there's just so few podcasts and so many great films, and terrible films to talk about. So we haven't really talked about any Kiwi splatter, so New Zealand horror.
Yes.
We will get there because we have some that we have to talk about.
Obviously,
but that's how I learned about this company, and I just is through some of those, like, really not big hits but fantastic films. And I think that every horror film should be required to have practical effects. They can have CGI too, but, like, that's one of the reasons this film is so good, is because it doesn't feel like they blew their budget on CGI, or that they just were like, oh, well, we don't have a budget. They did it right.
And Dougherty actually talks about how he used these puppets, that he built the puppets, and he was very similar to what Ripley Scott did with Alien. And in the chest burster scene in Alien, he didn't tell the cast what to expect. He said, something's about to happen, you've read the script, you know that something will be here, but he didn't show them ahead of time. The same thing happened here.
And you can tell in Alien, right? Like, when that blood splatters their faces and they're, like, really honestly, like, shocked. Like, it's hard to fake that. Mm-hmm. And so you're saying that they
did the same thing. They did not show the puppets or any of these things to the cast. And they actually, this is really interesting, they had own special trailers for these puppet figures.
Oh my gosh.
So that the actors couldn't see them and they couldn't just walk into set. And the actors were not allowed to come onto set until all of the puppet things had been set up, so as not to ruin the surprise.
That's fantastic. Perhaps scarring for those children. I don't know if they'll be forever haunted, but I like that. I'm going to start doing that. I don't know how, but I'm going to start doing it.
Just every class you teach, just have like weird puppet animatronics.
Yeah, that you can't see until the start of class.
Yeah, very good. There's a lot of history to draw on with the Krampus, as the Krampus is a real-life figure, but in fact, the Krampus's roots have nothing to do with Christmas, if you can believe it. Instead, this is according to SmithsonianMagazine.com, they date back to pre-Germanic paganism in the region. His name originates with the German Krampen, which means claw, and the tradition has it that he is the son of the Norse god of the underworld, Hel. During the 12th century, the Catholic Church attempted to banish Krampus celebrations because of his resemblance to the devil. So, the Krampus himself historically comes around the night of December 5th, tagging along with St. Nicholas. He visits all of the houses at night with his saintly pal, while St. Nick is there to put the candy in the shoes of the good children and birk twigs in the shoes of the bad. Krampus. His particular specialty is punishing naughty children. Legend has it that throughout the Christmas season, misbehaved children are beaten with birk branches or can disappear, stuffed into Krampus's sack and hauled off to his lair to be tortured or eaten.
It's pretty dark. Delightfully dark.
Delightfully dark.
But can you imagine growing up and just knowing that, like, you extra have to be good? Like, you know, I mean, it's not just like, oh, well, I might get some coal, or it's like, oh, I might be beaten with a stick.
With a stick, or if I'm really bad, stuffed in a sack and hauled to Krampus's lair, where I will then be either tortured or eaten.
I just feel as though I would have had a lot of anxiety. No wonder all of their lifespans were so short, because they spent their entire childhood being terrified.
Mm-hmm. So, in the same interview with Dean of Geek that I referenced earlier with Daughtry, they asked him if he drew on any specific tradition for Krampus, and he says that all cultures kind of like have this creepy Christmas holiday figure, whether it's Krampus, Black Pete, or Belsa-Nickel. They all have these creepy holiday figures, and so he didn't just put it to any one specific version of this holiday demon, so it allowed him to just like take bits and pieces of different lores and put them together. Like the Krampus himself doesn't have any helpers. It's just Krampus. But some of the other cultures have little helpers, and so he was like, that's interesting, I want those. So while they didn't technically come directly from the Krampus lore, they came from other things that he drew on, and so it allowed him to create this melding pot of cultural, creepy, holiday badness.
Which, if we go back to the idea of the monster's body as a cultural product, what better representation of an American monster than a melted pot version?
Indeed. It fits so perfectly.
It does.
So, Krampus was released on December 4th, 2015, and it grossed $60 million worldwide against a $15 million budget. It was received by critics and audiences alike. Rotten Tomatoes scores a 67 from critics and a 51 from audiences. The Metacritic is a 45 from critics.
It's not fantastic.
And a 7.5 from audiences. And the cinema score is a B-.
Anthony and I were discussing, like, before we started recording, we were like, just to make sure we're on the same page, we both did like it, right? And we were like, yes, we did. And I think that it's important that we kind of acknowledge that we're not saying that, like, if you can only watch one horror film, that this should be the horror film that you watch. Nor are we necessarily saying that this is one that's going to yield...
It should be the Thanksgiving horror
Yeah,
film.
Exactly. Of course it should.
Obviously.
Obviously. And podcast done. But, like... This is a solid horror film. This is kind of a delightful romp. This does some good things, as we've talked about, with, the creature makeup. Mm-hmm. It's got some good horror mixed with comedy. It does nice things with pacing. It's just kind of a fun film.
It can definitely break up the monotony of just, like, happy Christmas films that you enjoy and you just suffer through. Place it in between... perhaps you're watching of The Grinch.
Yeah,
or
The
something
Grinch and
else.
Christmas Vacation, A Christmas Story. Like, I mean, it works so nicely, right?
Yeah.
I also think it breaks up the monotony of watching horror films that also make you sort of suffer, right? Because horror, so much of it is makes you be like, wow, so humanity's disgusting and I hate everyone. And it's just nice sometimes to be reminded that it can not make you feel like you were the scum of the earth. Or like you will never get those images out of your brain. Like, this is just kind of a nice palate cleanser for both Christmas movies and horror movies.
I don't know if the film necessarily is a total palate cleanser.
Really?
From that. I think that this film does kind of operate from a disaffirmative angle in the sense that it does treat humans as kind of the problem. From the beginning of the film, it starts with, like, you hear this creepy... stereotypical horror music that is playing as the cold Universal logo comes out, and it's horror. But then it suddenly switches to, like, very cheery Christmas music, and then you get to watch evil human corporatism at work.
Yeah, so I actually think that opening is fantastic. I don't know what it is. I'm just kind of a sucker for films that take a song that I have different emotions about, and then put it to usually violent things, and then they're like, remember how this is not okay. Like, The Purge does this as well, and their opening. And I think that this film does an excellent job, and so I agree with you that it is clearly saying that there's something kind of broken about our current Christmas season, especially as it's one that, is filled with consumerism, because I like the fact that the pageant, right, like the nativity scene is happening in the super tiny corner, right, like off the main beaten path, and even that's broken, right, because they're fighting. So I agree with you. I'm just not sure it carries through in its entirety, but we can talk about that.
We can definitely talk about that.
I think it's worthwhile, though, especially because we constantly talk about affirmative and disaffirmative horror, to just sort of take us back to, like, one of the foundational ways that we can be thinking about disaffirmative horror. So this is, again, coming from Linda Holland Toll in her book, As American as Mom, Baseball, and Apple Pie. And we've used her before to set up this framework of disaffirmative. I just think it's worth, like, reminding us as well as hopefully you all listening, like, what exactly we mean. And so she says, disaffirmative horror fiction, far from working to reassure us that the monsters are not us, forces a dis-ease, a full confrontation with the monstrous, with ourselves, from which we cannot walk away. And so you're saying that you see this film from beginning onward, really setting up that idea that maybe we are the bigger issue than Krampus.
Yes, and I think that this film, what allows it to ultimately be disaffirmative is that for so much of it, and this is going to sound paradoxical, so much of it does have very affirmative elements where it gives you the illusion, like, oh, maybe it is just Krampus's fault. Go away. These humans and this lovely family could just go back to it. But none of that doesn't work out in the end. The stereotypical patriarchal father figure is not able to be the shepherd to protect his flock. The glorification of guns and, like, protecting yourself and being all that doesn't ultimately work out. This family is broken up, and when this kid comes back in the end and he's like, I just want Christmas to go back to the way it was, and evokes those very, like, nostalgic elements, Krampus says, alright, into the pit you go, and then traps them forever.
Yeah, so I want to argue that it is more affirmative throughout than I think you think it is. But I'm going to do so by first agreeing with you. Because one of the things, because to carry that through, from the beginning, we're sort of taught to see the family that's coming to visit as being lesser, right?
Or other.
Because they are poorer, and they constantly are making references to, like, how nice things are, and it's like, but shouldn't you just be appreciative as how you're taught to feel about them? There's that whole, like, possibility that the dad wants the two older girls to be, boys, and so there's, like, this weird, like, gender dynamic, and there's the youngest son who's, like, on his way to diabetes, which, by the way, I have an idea for the title of a horror comedy called Diabetes. I don't have any more than that, but I just thought I'd throw that out.
It's always best to start with a pun when it comes to
I believe
horror.
every horror should have puns. So, but we realize very quickly into the film that the, quote, perfect family is broken as well. And some of it is the obvious refrain of, like, the husband and wife are not quite happy, but also the daughter's clearly dating a druggie. Even if it's just, pot, he's still, like, he has a holiday bong. Like, how much weed do you have to smoke to actually have a holiday themed bong? I would imagine the answer is a decent chunk. So, and we assume she's probably having premarital sex. And even, like, they don't treat Oma very nicely throughout. They kind of, like, use her. There's that line where he's like, you don't need to make cookies anymore. We bought some store-bought ones, right? So we see that this family is also broken.
And you just see her be broken inside.
I know. The second time watching this film through, I kept thinking that, like, she was kind of evil, like, that we were going to find out that she had brought Krampus, because she seems so dissatisfied the entire film. But yeah, you're right, that it does set up this idea that even the quote, good model is broken. I just think that it doesn't carry through these threads as effectively as it could. So the opening is fantastic, but I don't feel like the issue of consumerism, although it's mentioned in various moments, I don't feel like it's carried through as thoroughly as it could be. Or the idea of, like, the patriarchal family unit. At the end of the day, the dads both do sacrifice themselves for their families, and so they're not successful in doing it, but we are sort of taught, like, but isn't this a nice model? Wouldn't it be nice if it worked? But isn't it nice that there's still this, like, system in place? I don't know, I just felt like there were times that it was just a little bit, it didn't go as far as it needed to truly be disaffirmative.
I don't know, I think that the opening of the film is what forces you to make those connections, and what allows it to be disaffirmative. Well, sure, it doesn't do as good of a job of carrying through some of those strands from the opening in terms of just, like, the corporatism, consumerism, humans bad, they've done terrible things with this Christmas holiday. I think that it's kind of a cold opening of sorts, in that it doesn't have any direct impact on the rest of the film and the plot. But I think it's what forces you to be viewing this and all of humanity in a negative light.
Yeah, that makes sense. It really does. And I'm almost there. I'm like 75% willing to say that this film is disaffirmative. I think what may be holding me back beyond just the, like, I don't know if it always carries through, is that Max does not intentionally call forth Krampus. Not even intentionally, right? It's not like it's like there's this bell and it says Krampus and he's like, what's this? And he shakes it. Like, all he does is he rips up his Christmas note. And, like, the grandmother also, all she wanted was, well, she was a little darker. She wanted everyone to disappear. But, like, yeah, that's a bad example.
No, that one doesn't work.
No. She definitely asked for it. But I just felt like with this particular family, they're bad, but they're no worse than any other family. And okay,
I think that's the point. I think that might be the point. I think that's how we know it's disaffirmative, and I think the fact that people can point to it and be like, oh, well, maybe Krampus might be coming for my family this year, because maybe we get into fights over Christmas dinner. Maybe we do spend too much money. Maybe we've lost the spirit of Christmas. Krampus is coming for us because we as humanity have a pretty warped sense of what Christmas is now, and, like, have lost the pure Christmas.
I think maybe now I'm 80%.
Hey-o.
Yeah, I still don't think it's quite
That's a solid B minus.
Yeah, that is. I mean, before it was a C.
It was a C.
So, I mean, we've raised a significant amount. I think it could have been a little bit better.
Oh, and I agree. I think it could have.
And I think it needed to be fully disaffirmative.
I think that's probably true. I think that some of the elements in the background of the film serve to, like, further this, like, darker disaffirmative thing. Like, just, like, little things. Like, when you see classic Christmas items, but they're warped now, like this Santa candle with
that was fantastic.
Wax dripping down the side.
The red wax.
The
so
red wax.
Like
so it
blood,
looks like Santa's bleeding. Or like when...
And also, like, how creepy is it that, like, the way that we celebrate this figure is by setting him on fire, like, and destroying him. Like, it's a very funny... And we do that all the time, really. So there's some interesting commentary.
And there's just other little examples throughout that are just, like, taking these things and flipping them on their head and showing, like, why do we do that? Why is this? What are we doing, humanity?
Let's jump to the end of the film, which we both were rather delighted by the, like, little twist to it, or, like, the little, like, but wait, there's more. Because I think if it had just ended with, like, Max waking up and it was all a dream, first off, that would have been the worst.
It would have been a terrible ending.
I'm never in your film or anything and then they woke up. Unless you're going to say, and then they woke up and realized they were in even darker hell. Like, that's the only way you can do that. But there's something for me about the fact that, like, we see that Christmas, a perfect version of Christmas, does have presents being opened, and it does have all the, quote, best trappings of the holiday season. And even though we realize that they are trapped in hell, I think because I didn't see what it was about that was hellish.
But see, I think that is what makes it disaffirmative, because all of these stereotypical things that we associate with, like, the perfect good Christmas are there in hell. And why are they there in hell with them in this trapped snow globe that they've found themselves in for all eternity, if not to punish them? Because some of the final things we hear about Krampus is, like, that he doesn't come to give, he comes to punish.
It's true.
So he punishes this family with what the classic elements of Christmas are.
83%.
Yes!
Yeah.
I'm moving
no
on
higher. No higher, but I will give it a solid B in terms of effort. It's not quite there, but I think you're right.
I agree. I agree. It's not quite there. It doesn't quite stick the landing. But
one of the things I like, though, about the fact that there are certainly disaffirmative elements is that we've talked before about how, like, yes, we get it. Thank you for showing us that, like, premarital sex is such a horrible thing. And that sometimes it just, like, when a film is super affirmative, it's, like, gross about it.
Cough, cough, Halloween.
Yeah, and even my love of Halloween can't ignore that. But I feel like because this film is disaffirmative, Krampus is disaffirmative for so much of it, but still has these affirmative elements, it can do so in a way that feels a little less, like, icky about it. Because it's taking it on a slightly higher level than just the obvious, like, well, if you do this, you're gonna die.
You're gonna die, yeah.
Because even, like, the kid who's, the cousin who's definitely eating way more food than he should. He's not a bad person.
No.
So there's never like of course you deserve to die. Like, people apologize. People make up, and so nobody is 100% bad, and so it's like, of course you were punished. It's like everyone's just bad enough.
Yeah.
And that's a really kind of interesting way to explore things. One of the questions that I find really interesting about monster theory is this question of classification. So I don't think anyone is going to disagree, having seen this version of Krampus, that he's just misunderstood, or that he's not a villainous character in this particular story. Like, he's definitely out to punish the family. We have a voiceover narrative that tells us such. So I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. But I wonder if people could argue whether or not he's truly a monster, or you said you thought he was more of a god?
He seems more god-like to me. He comes in, he's like, he's here because bad things have happened, and so he's come to punish. It doesn't feel like very, like motivated or directed. Like, it's not a lot of spite behind it. It's just, hey, you guys messed up. You're one of your own called me here due to how bad this entire family been being, so now I gotta do this thing.
Yeah, he definitely, it's not making this personal, right? This is just, like, this is his duty and his obligation. And even in, like, some of our slasher films where it's not personal, you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you never feel like, oh, but you're justified in what you're doing. But, like, Krampus has been set up to do this. Everyone knows this is what Krampus does.
This is his purpose. It reflects, like, some of those, the mythical things about this character. The Krampus is the yin to St. Nicholas's yang.
I agree, and I think that it's very fascinating that almost all Western European cultures have some sort of version of this, like, but you can't just get good things, right? There has to be this dark side. So, like, I think there's a really interesting sort of dynamic there. But I find myself wondering whether or not gods, and I mean gods more in the pagan sort of definition of them, aren't just monsters, if there really is a distinction between them. Because I feel like if I go through those 7 theses of, like, what Cohen said, here's what I think makes for a monster, to me they're exactly what makes for a god. It's just that gods tend to have perhaps more power or more ability to influence things, but they are also a representation of cultural identities. They're also a harbinger of category crisis. Think about the number of gods that are, either half animal or half human, or that are, like, half warrior and half poet. There's just a lot of those. The only thing that's different is Cohen says that monsters are our children and we are the children of the gods, right? So that would be the distinction, which would mean then that in this case we're the monsters. So I don't know, perhaps it doesn't work, but for me I just feel like gods are monsters 9 times out of 10. And Krampus in this case is a godlike monster or a monster-like god. I'm not sure it matters which way we see him, because the end result is the same. He's going to punish us, and he's going to remind us that we might not be as fantastic as we think we are.
So if I'm willing to admit that maybe God and monster are closer to the same, then that would mean you would, by what you just said, admit that because gods come there to remind us that we may not be as good as we are, that it's pretty solidly disaffirmative.
Yeah, so sometimes when you say something, and even as you're saying that, you're like, I wish these words weren't exiting my mouth because I had not fully thought out the ramifications of the thought. As the words were leaving my mouth and as I saw this, like, gleam, you had this, like, hunter's gleam, you were like, wait for it, she can't stop now. and I couldn't, like, and I wanted to, I really just wanted to stop and then, like, edit it out and pretend we never had this conversation. But maybe you're right. And so maybe I still want to say it a solid B, but I'm willing to say that this film is definitely disaffirmative, even if some of its disaffirmativeness is almost accidental, or, like, perhaps it goes beyond what was crafted in the text and goes into our analysis, right? And so so maybe the text is not as disaffirmative as my reading of the text has to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that does. I think that definitely does make sense. I always love these podcast episodes where one of us changes our mind.
I know, and I'm glad that it's not just the same one of us every time, because that would be a sign of some weak thoughts. But yeah, I think, and that's why I like this, right? It's because I feel like the only way to really understand how you feel about something is to engage in discourse, is to have someone be like, but and then you're like, yeah, and then you have to justify yourself.
I haven't always had someone to talk about horror with, because I imagine many of the viewers out there don't always have people who quite like horror as much as you.
Yeah,
so
definitely not. And it, like, from childhood onward. So I know some people were really lucky that, like, their parents would watch horror with them. My dad would, but my mom would always be, like, sad. And so it was like, okay, well, we just won't. So yeah, it's taken a long time to find people that are willing to have these conversations, especially about films like Krampus, right? Which
exactly,
is like,
yeah.
It's like, should you have just spent 50 minutes talking about Krampus? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, I would say so.
But I don't think most people are going to take you up on that offer if you were like, hey, guess what we're doing for this next hour?
I've sent you a Google Calendar invite. We're going to talk about Krampus for 50 minutes.
I just feel like that would be a way to, like, end most friendships. I'm like, I just feel like I would start avoiding you if I didn't also send you or want to send you Google
Calendar.
Yeah, where I'm like, hey, but we could also discuss Thanksgiving, you know? So.
Exactly.
Well, I feel like this was like a present to ourselves where we got to have a lovely conversation about a film that deserves to have conversations about it, even if it's maybe not going to be a film that you're going to put on your top 10 horror films.
You don't have to. You just need to perhaps include it this year in your holiday watchings.
Exactly. That's all that we ask of you.
Really throw it, if you've got a family, throw it on like right after like Elf or something.
Yeah,
to really just like give your kids a warm wake up.
Yeah, what a great way to celebrate Christmas by starting with Elf and ending with Krampus. That just sounds like for a delightful pairing. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. And we are excited about our next episode.
Yes, our next episode, our next gift to you.
Oh gosh, no.
Is going to be 2019's Midsommar.
And of course, we're not gifting you the film so much as our discussion about the film.
Right, you do need to have seen it or have just go by it. I mean, we are not going to give that to you. No, just the episode.
Just the episode. And we're going to have a lively debate because this is a film, Midsommar, that deserves a very lively debate. So thank you and happy holidays, and we look forward to the next episode.